Welcome. As an objectivist activist, it would make a very nice story to say that the way I transitioned from Marxism to objectivism was that one day I came across a work of Ayn Rand, and that's when everything started. But the truth is that the moment that I will always remember as the turning point in my intellectual development did not involve Ayn Rand, because at that point I didn't even know of Ayn Rand. It involves a philosopher who is flawed in every possible way, flawed as a person, and some could even say flawed as a philosopher. And this is Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous French intellectual, novelist, and philosopher. So today I'm going to talk about the essay, the lecture that then turned to an essay by Jean-Paul Sartre called Existentialism is a Humanist, and how it played a role in my life. And you could find the interest in terms of how one's intellectual development can change from one random event, or you might find the interest on going through the essay, because we're going to do this, and finding the main points in Sartre and talking a bit about Sartre's existential phase. So both of these things hopefully could be of interest to some of you. So the year is 2012. It's the summer of 2012. I'm in the deepest level into my Marxism then. It's the point where I'm taking Marxism really seriously, and I'm reading everything by Marx, all the classics, Engels, Lenin, you name it. And actually the lightest thing I can read, the thing that I consider the only deviation that I allow myself from, is something like Zizek. To put it into perspective, today Zizek would be considered a very hardcore communist. At my time, back then, it was like bedtime reading, because this guy is not orthodox Marxist enough. So at that point, I was a PhD student at the University of Kent, and I was friends, I still am, with Ashley Frawley, the person who debated Yaron on the first Yaron Debates Europe series. And we had the same supervisor, and that supervisor was Frank Furedi. You might know him, he writes for Spiked. And we had this competition with Ashley on who will be the best pupil of Frank, who is going to make Frank prouder. And Frank Furedi is someone who comes from Marxism, but he's someone who believes in human agency, he believes in free speech, he believes in free will. So at that point, I was captured by his personality, but I didn't really get into these things. I was like, okay, how does this fit with Marxism? And if it doesn't fit with Marxism, yeah, Frank is a cool guy, but that's as good as it gets. So summer of 2012, the Academy of Ideas, back then the Institute of Ideas, were having their summer retreat, which is a very nice 2-day event with lectures and a lot of intellectual, let's say, exchange of ideas. And I couldn't be there. And Ashley was texting me, "You are missing. Frank's talk is brilliant. You have to listen to Frank's talk." So after a couple of months, his talk is on, it was a podcast, and I listened to it. And the topic was, you can find it in YouTube, From Existentialism to Neuroscience, Condemned to be Free. So Frank talks about how existentials talk about free will and how this is different from today's culture, which is uncomfortable with the idea of human agency. So I said, okay, let's give it a go. And within that lecture, Frank talks about Sartre and his Existentialism is a Humanism lecture. So I close the personal parenthesis, and now we travel to Sartre, and we find ourselves in Paris in 1945. So he delivers this lecture in the 29th of October in 1945. Now imagine the setting. It's been 1 year since the liberation of Paris, and it's been a week since the first elections, post-war elections in Paris, where the Communist Party, which is the party around which all the most of the French intellectuals are somewhere in its orbit, has won the most votes. And these elections gave the parliament that would negotiate the new constitution or something like that. So the air is buzzing with ideas, but also the air is buzzing with pessimism. Because what has gone wrong? How do we find ourselves as a humanity being captured by the totalitarianism of Nazism and of fascism? I would also say of Stalinism, but of course, the French Communist Party wouldn't bother a lot with this. But also how did France find itself defeated and capitulated to the Vichy regime? So the existentials, who was this movement that has gone through some time, so there are various streams in it, but let's say the French stream of existentialism in the 1930s and in the 1940s tried to make a difference in this atmosphere of pessimism. And in this atmosphere where it looked like the structures around you would determine your life, that every individual was just a cog in the machine. Whether, again, you take Nazism, fascism, or even the FDR United States, everywhere you looked, you'd see collectivism and the individual being crushed. So in that intellectual atmosphere, Sartre decides to give this talk. And this talk, in his mind, is mostly a reply to the critiques of existentialism. And again, imagine the moment. So the talk is supposed to be given in a place called Club Maintenant, something like a lecture theater. Sartre, short, with awkward looking, shows up, and it's filled beyond capacity. Every major intellectual is there. And according to sources, most of the people are there because they're very curious on what he wants to say, and they want to cause him a hard time. Because again, existentialism does not fit in well with the dominant intellectual tradition in France at that time. So that's where we find ourselves. So Sartre begins his talk, and he says, this is mostly going to be a reply to the critics of existentialism. So he begins by trying to say that what existentialism is about. So he says, look, by reading my novels, because in the 30s, Sartre had written some novels like Nausea, or his pamphlets or whatever, people would accuse him that, aren't you existentialists, these people who think that everything is gloomy? Or aren't you the ones that do not believe in collective action and you think that every individual makes whatever he or she wants of their life? So this is the focus of his critique. And he starts by saying that what existentialism is about is that it confronts man with the possibility of choice. So he says, look, we live in a world where the individual seems to be crushed. But the first point I want to make is that existentialism is that you have the possibility of choice. That no matter where you are, even in a concentration camp, Sartre would say, because he was a POW to the Germans, according to some sources, he escaped. According to other sources, he told them his health was deteriorating and they let him go. But he said, even in the concentration camp, you can choose. Even on the torture chamber, you can choose. That's not in the Existentialist Humanist, but he mentioned it elsewhere. So we are talking about the possibility of choice. And then he says that the main tenet, the main core of existentialism is that, and objectivists are going to cringe a bit, existence precedes essence. What he means by that? What he means by that is that there is no human nature. And why there is no human nature? Because he says there is no God. Since there is no God, we are nothing particular. What are we then? We are what we make of ourselves. And that is his main point. So man is nothing else, he says, but that which he makes of himself. That is the first principle of existentialism. And that was the first thing that hit me on the head. Man is what makes of himself? That sounds cool and heroic, but how does this stand with my Marxism? Again, I was in a super structural Marxism phase then. I was reading Althusser, I was reading Pouladjas, I was reading people for whom the individual doesn't really count. And here is someone saying, man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. So I said, okay, let's give this guy a go. And then he says that the first effect of existentialism is that it puts every man in possession of himself as he is and places the entire responsibility for his existence squarely upon his own shoulders. So a main thing here is that you have the responsibility for your life, for the good things and for the bad things. Now, again, you see that if you don't know anything about Sartre, and try to forget anything you know about Sartre, and let me say as a spoiler that Sartre did not necessarily live by this philosophy, and this philosophy is not there in Sartre's politics. But these ideas, I think, are quite powerful. So the entire responsibility for your existence is in your own shoulders. And then he says it's not only that, but man is responsible for himself, but also you are responsible for all other men. So another very famous quote by Sartre, that you're responsible for every other man around you. And what does he mean by that? Does he mean that you have to go around looking for whom to sacrifice? He says not exactly. He says that all the actions that you make in terms of creating yourself is also a manifestation to the world of what should be the ideal human being in terms of the ideal action. So basically, you create yourself in the image of what man ought to be. Reminds us a bit of Rand's definition of romantic art. But here, Sartre says your life is basically a piece of art, something like that. So you create through yourself what you want to see in human beings. And he brings the example of someone who, imagine he says someone who joins a Christian union as someone who joins a communist trade union. This is a choice that shows how you want to see yourself, passive or active, caring about the thinking that the world can change, or staying back and say, okay, God's gonna take care of all that. So I see we have some superchats. Thank you very much. I'm gonna get to them in a second. So then he says, now he goes to the most important question, which is, what do we do in the absence of God? Which is, in a way, the most famous, at least to people who are not experts, and I'm by no means an expert in existentialism. This is the most famous, let's say, one of the most famous existential creeds. Comes from Dostoevsky. In the absence of God, everything is permitted. So Sartre now has to ask the question, if there is no God, what are we to do? So this is a good place to make a very short pause and see a couple of questions so that we catch our breath. So Scott asks, when you were more pro-Marx, did you accept the Marxist sense of inevitable victory? I think it's part of how they demoralize those who oppose them. In a way, yes, but see how Sartre is actually I'm gonna answer you, Scott, and thank you so much for your super chat. I'm gonna answer you through Sartre. The quick answer was yes. So I thought that either through revolution or even better, through technological determinism, Marxism is going to win. So we're going to get to the point of 3D printing, sharing economy, automation, therefore communism. I was on this type of Marxism. So yes, I believed in the inevitability. And Sartre mentions this in a while, so hold this and we're going to get there. And many thanks to Robert, Marilyn, Sally, and Sammy. Thank you so much for your super chat. So let's go to the big question now. The absence of God. So Sartre says, well, you could say that the fact that there is no God is, okay, now it's a relief. I can relax and do what I want. No, says Sartre. Quote, the existentialist, on the contrary, finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. So basically what he means is, there is no God, there is no ought, there is no you should do this. By the way, interestingly, Sartre would agree here with Prager type conservatives who say, if there is no God, there is no objective morality. So basically he says there can be no values a priori without God. Therefore, where do we find ourselves? So he continues, Dostoevsky once wrote, if God did not exist, everything would be permitted. And that for existentialism is the starting point. Everything is indeed permitting if God does not exist. And later he says, this is humanism because we remind man that there is no legislator but himself, that he himself thus abandoned must decide for himself. Notice the term he's using, abandoned. So this is not a vision where we are free and we should grasp this freedom. In a way, it's like we are alone and we have no idea what we're doing. Elsewhere, he calls it we're condemned to freedom. Notice, freedom becomes a penalty. Freedom becomes something like a punishment. So that's how he views the absence of God. And then he says his very famous phrase that We are left alone without excuse. Man is condemned to be free. And why condemned? Condemned because he did not create himself, yet it's nevertheless at liberty. And from the moment that he's thrown into this world, he is responsible for everything he does. So you bear the responsibility of freedom. And notice how for Randian heroes, this is something brilliant. This is something that that paves the way for everything else. For Sartre, this is almost an unbearable weight. And maybe that's why some of his heroes in his novel do not have this heroic vision and heroic stature in life like the Randian heroes. So then he says, man makes himself. He is not found ready-made. He makes himself by the choice of his morality, and he cannot but choose a morality. Now, here again, we have good Sartre. Here we find something which I found very exciting. So I have to take the responsibility to choose a path in life. So for Sartre, morality is a path in life. Again, you could see some parallel here with objectivism, where ethics, as Peikoff calls it, it's basically the leaflet, the guidance leaflet that you get for life. Except that for Peikoff, this guidance leaflet is something which comes from reality, whereas Sartre never really answers, how do we decide what morality to follow? And we see this dead end of Sartre ethics in the example he gives. And he gives the example of someone came to him and said, look, I'm in a dilemma. I want, let's say, I'm torn between staying in France with my mother who has lost one of her sons in war. She disdains my father because he's a collaborator. Or I should go and fight. I should travel around the Europe and find myself in free England and join the resistance there. And Sartre says, how can we decide which of the two options are right? Because if we take traditional morality, both are good. Why? Because they're both sacrifices in a way, I would say. In the one case, you sacrifice for your mother. In the other case, you sacrifice for your country. So Sartre says both look right. And then, so you see, he notices that there's something weird with this morality, but it's very unclear for Sartre what is the way out. It's very unclear for Sartre how you can reach an ease from an ought. And therefore, his answer to that person is, you are free, you know what can be done, there is no general morality that can tell you what to do. Then he continues his essay. So Marilyn asks, what is the standards for what man ought to be? Sartre standard. I couldn't answer this question, Marilyn. I don't have an answer to that. It's very, very unclear what Sartre considers the standard. At some point, he goes to this universalizing thing that don't do to you, whatever the standard is, it's something that needs to be universalizable, or whatever the term is. So there is this Kantian notion here that whatever you do, imagine everyone doing it, that should be the thing that you have to do. But he never gives a particular answer. The answer is basically in voluntarism. The answer is in action. The answer is you have to take a path and follow it. Of course, one could easily think, let's say a fascist in the Spanish Civil War, saying, well, the obvious thing is we need to defeat the Reds and defend the glory of Spain. Therefore, I'm going to jump voluntaristically in this world of action, and my existentialism leads me to fascism. So I'm very curious what would be Sartre's reply to that person. So then he throws some red meat to the communists in the audience, which was, you could imagine, a big part of the audience. Sartre was never a part of the Communist Party, but his Modern Times, which was his magazine, I can't remember the title in France, it was sympathetic to the Communist Party. And again, after the war, the Communist Party had an aura. It was the party, the so-called the party of 75,000 martyrs, because it had 75,000 members executed in the resistance. So most of the intellectuals there were somehow related to the Communist Party. And there he throws them some red meat, as my friend Raka would say. And he says, look, the subjectivity does not mean that you are isolated from the masses and isolated from action. But to answer to our friend who asked, do you believe that in the inevitability of victory? Sartre says, actually, I don't believe in the inevitability of victory. I believe in action. So he says, I'm not going to say that my subjectivity lies in the victorious proletariat of the future, because the proletariat might not win. Maybe we're going to have fascism in 50 years. So I have to act now. I cannot say, well, we're going to win. So he's against what he calls quietism. And here is his point, which again, it will remind you something from Objectivism. He says, quote, man is nothing else but what he purposes. He exists only insofar as he realizes himself. He is therefore nothing else but the sum of his actions, nothing else but what his life is. So basically here he's talking about something like what objectivists would understand as integrity. So he says, it doesn't matter if you believe something, you have to act on it. And he gives the example that he says there is no love apart from the deeds of love. And there is no genius other than that which is expressed in works of art. So he says, you have to exercise the virtue. So if you believe, for example, in revolution, you have to go out and try to make it happen. You cannot just hope. And then comes, in my view, the most important part in terms of what is the importance of existentialism and humanism and what really kicked in me. So up to this point, I was basically reading this as a first time in my life, something that sounded like self-development, affirmation of the possibility of agency. I thought, that's very cool. And I could sense that there's something very radical in it, radical in terms of what is the world out there. And here comes the part that really, really hooked me in and really, really made me reconsider my Marxist determinism, or however we could call it. And it's an assault on what Ayn Rand calls the I couldn't help it attitude. You'll notice that the villains in Atlas Shrugged use, or not necessarily the villains, the weak, the people who are weak of character. I couldn't help it, Mr. Reardon. And it's basically, I'm a victim of my circumstances. And this was very powerful in France at that time. From one side, again, the determinism of the communists, and the other side, the defeatism. Well, yeah, we capitulated to the Germans, but what could have we done? Or yeah, I collaborated with the occupation forces. What could I do? Here is Sartre's reply. This is a relatively long quote, but it's very, very good. I'm going to read it. So he starts by saying, why don't people like the character in my novels? And he says, because the people in the character of my novels are responsible for their own shortcomings. Quote, if people condemn our works of fiction in which we describe characters that are base, weak, cowardly, and sometimes even, frankly, evil, it is not only because those characters are base, weak, cowardly, or evil. For suppose that, like Zola, Émile Zola, the author, we saw that the behavior of these characters was caused by their heredity, or by the action of their environment upon them, or by determining factors, psychic or organic. People would be reassured. They would say, you see, that is what we are like. No one can do anything about it. Again, Rand is heavily criticizing this idea. I couldn't help it. And how powerful it is today, right? No one is to blame for anything today. It's always something in the past. I mean, you even see it in superhero movies. The villain, something happened to him when he was 5 years old and then he couldn't help it. Going back to Sartre. But the existentialist, when he portrays a coward, shows him as responsible for his cowardice. He's not like that on account of a cowardly heart or lungs or cerebrum. He has not become like that through his psychological organism. He's like that because he has made himself into a coward by actions. So basically, Sartre says, if you're a coward, you only got yourself to blame. And later he says, The existentialist says that the coward makes himself cowardly, the hero makes himself heroic, and that there is always a possibility for the coward to give up cowardice and for the hero to stop being a hero. How relevant is this in our times? How great this is in the times that almost no one believes this. Everyone today is, the most popular thing in the culture regarding this today is I was born this way, or I couldn't help it, or it's the environment. So basically here, this is also in a way a celebration of free will, or you could see it as a celebration of free will. Now, how much does Sartre really believe that? Because again, if we are condemned to be free, and then freedom is not necessarily an option, it's almost the default, but because it's the default, it's also a burden. So it never becomes very clear where Sartre is going with that. But again, this by itself, for me, it hit me like a rock. And I found another very interesting thing in Sartre's part, and I will close with this, that I never noticed till I read it today. Notice his defense here of universalism against something which I don't know how popular it was in 45, but it is very popular today. And it's this idea of positionality. This idea that, well, as a person of color, I think this. As a woman, I think this. As a Greek, I think this. Sartre says, every purpose, even that of a Chinese, an Indian, or a black person, he uses the term, the N word that was used then, can be understood by a European. To say it can be understood means that the European of 1945, when he gives a lecture, may be striving out of a certain situation towards the same limitations in the same way, and that he may reconceive in himself the purpose of the Chinese, of the Indian, or the African. In every purpose, there is universality, in this sense that every purpose is comprehensible to every man. Compare this to today, which says, well, you cannot understand the struggles of these people, therefore, for example, you cannot play in a TV series someone who is, let's say, part of the LGBT community because there is no communication there. You cannot really get it. And Sartre says the exact opposite. He says, no, the struggles are universal and we have the capacity to understand them in a universal way. By the way, Sartre would be completely cancelled today for every possible reason, but that's something else. And then he comes to the conclusion, existentialism is nothing else but an attempt to draw the full conclusions from a consistently atheistic position. And again, what is the atheistic position? There is no God. We are condemned to be free. Thank you very much, Jonathan, by the way, for your super chat. And thank you, everyone, for your super chats. So here's the takeaway. I today, in retrospect, consider that moment when I listened to Frank Furedi's lecture and then read this essay, a turning point. But it was also a slow burn. So I read it, I was excited. Then I go back to Marx. I doubled down on Marxism and Althusserianism, but the seed of doubt was already there. And in a way, once you come across with these ideas, with the idea that, no, your life is on you. It's like you're hooked on a drug in a good way. And then everything else is, oh, you think Marx is radical? Here, you're told that you make whatever you want of your life in terms of your morality. In a way, he's saying something which I find relevant to what Ron said. You are creating your own soul. Man is a I don't remember what's exactly quote with a being of a self-made soul, something like that. So in a way, Sartre coming from a different direction says the same thing here. And I found that very, 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 very revolutionary. And I could never go back in some way in the big scheme of things after I came across these ideas. And that's why then when I came across Rand, everything fit in. Now, again, Sartre is full of contradictions. very, very flawed individual, from some elements of his relationship with the Beauvoir, of his some very dubious and gray area sexual encounters, to his, where to begin? His sanctioning of the worst authoritarian regimes. But again, this is not a sanctioning of Sartre. In a way, this moment is a moment of brilliance out of character for Sartre. Sartre never really returns there. And if you hear, I think it's Frank mentioned it in his lecture, Sartre didn't even want this to become an essay. In a way, the success of this speech went beyond what he wanted. So Sartre was not very comfortable in this world, turns out. So, but again, it's a piece of work that I find brilliant, and I would encourage you to check it out, particularly those of you who already have the objectivist, let's say, framework to spot the mistakes or to spot the problems and get the inspiration. And again, remember, this comes at a time where these ideas were almost as unpopular as they are today. And imagine Sartre again in an audience of, I don't know, 4,000 people standing against them basically and saying, you know what, you are all determinists, structuralists, whatever. We are whatever we make of ourselves, and we are basically beings of self-made character. I don't want to use Rand's term, but we are beings of self-made character. So this is all I had to say about this. So again, not the greatest story to tell in a knock-on that, or to an objectivist audience, that yeah, it was Sartre that started my pulling away from Marxism. But I owe intellectual debt definitely to Frank Furedi, and I encourage all of you to go to listen to his lecture. You can find it in YouTube. Not the best of sound, but you'll get it. Again, it's called From Existentialism to Neuroscience, Condemned to be Free. Anyway, boss, do we have anything that I have to announce people? Oh, Frank is debating Yaron soon, on July 6th, I hear. Excellent. So you're going to see Frank Furedi soon in the Yaron Debates Europe series. So what else? Let me say something about, I've mentioned many times the program of the Ayn Rand Center called the Communication Bootcamp. And this is actually open only for members. It's run by Don Watkins, and it helps us become better communicators. Now, if you're thinking, this program started 3 weeks ago and I've missed the first 3 classes, don't see it this way. Even if you show up to a random communication bootcamp, there's always something relevant, because every time we discuss something different. And to prove to you that I'm not just praising this, but I actually believe there's a lot of value in it, next Thursday, we are discussing one of my works. So I want Don to tear this work into pieces so it becomes better. I have to write basically a summary of my tribalism book. And for a think tank, for a friendly think tank, do I have the book here to show it? No. Anyway, doesn't matter. So I want Don to completely, quote, destroy me, because that's how I'm going to become better. And by you seeing the process, you're going to become also better communicator. So sometimes it's a speech that we discuss. Sometimes it's a written piece of work. Other time it might be something like Twitter or how to do YouTube, whatever. So if you're on the fence, shall I join, shall I not join? I think without any doubt, the fact that you can have once every week Don Watkins giving a free class on communication is definitely worth the membership fee. Okay, we have one last super chat. Thank you so much, Bonnie. My Sartre lecture was Mr. Dog by Margaret Brown, that my mother read to me at 4 years. A boy says, I'm a boy and I belong to myself, like a rock. So yeah, you can find such inspirational moments again from the work of Sartre, and you can keep them in terms of, you don't have to say, oh, this guy is, of course, you hold the context that, you know, I'm not gonna uncritically accept him, but I do believe that there is something very valuable to be fond in these ideas, particularly if you're a Stalinist and if the first time in your life that you come across the mere idea that you can be a person of self-made character. So happy to see, Bonnie, that I'm not the only one who found some inspiration from this type of stuff. Okay, 8 o'clock today, UK time, the Integrating Investor with Seth Levin. Tomorrow, peak, of course, only for members. Monday, Harry Binswanger is going to discuss the role of experts. Tuesday, Yaron is debating, I think, a conservative. It's going to be interesting. Follow us on social media, become members, and you're gonna. There's a lot of good stuff coming. Thank you so much for supporting us. Thank you for keeping me company today. I think we have a clubhouse. Yeah, we have a clubhouse where we can have some follow-up discussion about Sartre and whether you have found any value in him. Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.